About the Black Indian hypothesis debunked. And so I'm going to talk about some things that keep coming up in discussions. People keep bringing up and raising the question about Black Indians. And what I'd like to do today is hopefully clarify some issues and put some things in context so that we can get a better understanding of this issue regarding the Black Indians. First of all, let's be clear that there are Black people of African descent who were enslaved by the Indian or Native American population, especially amongst the so-called 5 civilized tribes, as well as other tribes. But there was slavery practiced by the Indians or Native Americans, and Black people of African descent were enslaved, taken into slavery, who were brought into Americas through various different means. They were either purchased directly, sometimes they were captured in conflicts with Europeans. There were a lot of different ways, but there were a significant population of Black people who became enslaved by Native American tribes. And many of these individuals also gained their freedom with the Native Americans. In many cases, they were Maroons who had escaped from YT people and who went and lived amongst the Native Americans and made alliances. So there's a variety of different ways that Native Americans and Africans that came to the Americas got together and became part of the same community, and many Africans adopted Indian or Native American culture. In addition to that, in terms of looking at and understanding the fact that there was intermarriage, so you have many people who were African and Native American descent, and we can see that in the DNA profiles today. And we can also understand the extent to which there was admixture. Today, the average Black American has about 0.8% Native American DNA. That would mean that out of, in the last between the 6th and 7th generation ago, they had at least one Native American ancestor that contributed to their bloodline. And so that would be one out of like 128 people. And so in terms of the other admixture, you can see that up to about 74% of their DNA profile comes from sub-Saharan Africa, particularly between modern Senegal and Angola. About 95% of African American and Black American ancestors come from that region, and then a little less than 4% come from Southeast Africa in Madagascar. So in terms of looking at and understanding the profile of Black Americans today in the United States, that's the general demographics of it. So there's very limited admixture with Native Americans, and that is in a period of time that goes back 6 to 7 generations at a minimum. So that's kind of the broad parameter. But what I want to do is I want to also mention the fact that if we go back and look historically at, for example, the reports by Europeans, even if you go back to Columbus, one of the things that Columbus interacted with the so-called Arawaks and Taino when he first arrived in the Americas, and one of the things that is reported in his writings that were copied by Bartholomew de la Casa. So there's documentation that Columbus actually, in communicating with the Native Americans, Native Americans reported to Columbus that blacks had come in ships and had brought, and they came from the south and southeast, and they brought with them gold-tipped spears. And so it's reported that Columbus actually had some of the gold, obtained some of the gold-tipped spears and had them analyzed back in Spain at a later time. And those spears had the same composition of spear tips, gold spear tips that they actually acquired from on the Guinea coast in Africa. And so there was a conclusion that blacks had arrived in ships in the Americas predating Columbus. And so there's other evidence as well. But the bottom line is that we have some presence of Africans coming in to trade and having some limited contacts. But the overall population of Native Americans pre-Columbus, the overwhelming evidence suggests that they, in fact, are Amerindian people, and that they actually came and arrived into the Americas through the Bering Strait, and that they came from the area region near Siberia and crossed over the Bering Strait and populated the Americas. Good morning. And when we look at the data, it's not until within the last several hundred years that that Native Americans actually migrated out to Polynesia and then began to interact and come into the Americas by way of the Pacific Ocean. And so, you have a small admixture that are from the Polynesian islands that come in much later. But when we look at the overall DNA profile and we see the Amerindian people that are descended from a distinctive source that includes the primarily through the Bering Strait and then a smaller admixture from Polynesia, what we see is a population of people that were largely melanated. In fact, the evidence shows that there was a variety of melanation. There were people that were considered YT. There were yellow people in South America. There were brown, red, and darker people that were melanated populations. But when we go through and look at the reporting and look at the data, look at the evidence, most were described morphologically very differently than Africans, and particularly with their hair texture, thick black hair, long hair, straight hair. When we began to look at the evidence and the record and look at the DNA profiles, it's very, very clear that even though you had melanated Native Americans in the Americas, that they are separate and distinct from the Africans. And Native Americans themselves made those distinctions. And we can look at, for example, just the interaction with Columbus, because, with this so-called interaction with Columbus, Native Americans are distinguishing themselves from Africans. In addition to that, there are numerous other instances where this becomes very clear, particularly later when we get into the 16 and 1700s. And then there's also records of conflicts with between Africans and Native Americans as well. And then later, when Native Americans actually got reservation land and they got land allotments, there's a broad number of court cases where Africans who had been enslaved by Native Americans or Africans who had admixed with Native Americans through marriage, their descendants attempted to gain access to tribal citizenship. And there's a whole body of legal doctrine that developed around this issue in terms of their blood admixture. And very clearly, there is a distinctive population of people that are African heritage who claim to be Native Americans by way of having been enslaved, even though they have no admixture. And then there are groups of people who are admixture of Native Americans and Africans who claim to be tribal citizens based upon their Native American portion of their heritage, but they acknowledge the existence and the evidence for their African heritage. What we're talking about today, when I talk about the Black Indian hypothesis debunked, what I'm really talking about today is that there is a modern group of Black people today that very recently, and most of these are really just on the internet, but you have a very large population growing of Black people who are now claiming that they are Black Aboriginal Native Americans, that they have always been here, and that they are separate and distinct and apart from the Amerindians, that they, in fact, are not related to the Amerindians, but they were already here. In addition to that, they claim that they are not related to Africans and they have no African heritage and that they were already here in the Americas. So this is the Black Indian hypothesis that I'm speaking about as I go into this. And the overwhelming evidence debunks this hypothesis. This is a fallacy. It's a fantasy. It's tantamount to "I never promised you a rose garden." If you're familiar, there was a book some years back that was called "I Never Promised You a Rose Garden," and it was about a person who got trapped in an imaginary world, and they lived in a separate alternate reality than everyone else, and they had mental issues that impacted them, that resulted in their withdrawal from reality, in their actually crafting a fantasy world for themselves. And so this hypothesis about the Black Aboriginal Native American, it is in fact a fantasy. This is a newly created fantasy. It's a cult type fantasy that's been created, and there's some people that promote it because it's a benefit for them to promote it, and then there are many people who are increasingly becoming victims of it because they really aren't in position to defend against it, and in the absence of a source of information to learn about their true history, they become victims and subjected to this cult fantasy. In addition to that, it's also very important to recognize the fact that there are malicious actors involved in this. There are several groups that do internet research and cybersecurity that have examined the cybersecurity environment and threats to Black identity that have been promoted through, for example, Russian troll farms, Iranian troll farms, Chinese troll farms, and conservative American troll farms that promote an identity conflict and crisis and division amongst Black people, so that Black people become divided, start arguing amongst each other. They become in conflict because it is to the benefit of many people that Black people did not get together, that Black people do not become united, that Black people are separated and arguing with each other and at each other's throats. So there are people promoting this division. And one of the tools that they've been using is promoting this, what many people will call the pretendian cult. And so I want to put that there in context and kind of go into just looking at some of the information. And there's a group called the Inskit group, and they do cyber threat analysis, and they have a cyber threats to the Black community is a report that they did, where you could find some information about the threats to Black identity that's coming from troll farms. And as many as 140 million Americans were reached each month by Russian troll farms from St. Petersburg, from Macedonia, and from other regions where troll farms are set up. And just imagine the reality of having, say, 300 or 400 people that are employed as trolls, as internet trolls, and each of them may manage up to 100 accounts, false accounts, cloned accounts, and they are promoting misinformation, and they have a source that's manufacturing posts that they pass these posts on to each other, and then they start pushing those posts out saying, where are the slave ships? Egypt is in America. They have all kinds of little sayings that they've promoted that have been designed to sow the seeds of doubt, to create division, to create conflict, to cause controversy, and to disrupt Black progress. And so it's important to understand the reality of the existence of these sources that are designed to actually divide the Black community. And so what I want to do is I want to address several different specific issues. One is I'll call it the myth of paper genocide. So let me start out by going back and saying it's very important, I think, for us to distinguish when Europeans arrived in the Americas. Of course, we hear the stories about Columbus arriving. We also hear the stories about in 1455, Pope Nicholas actually gave the Portuguese the authorization to begin the enslavement of sub-Saharan Black Africans. And then later, the so-called New World is supposedly discovered and divided by the Pope between the Portuguese and the Spanish. So there's a line that's drawn on a map that gives the eastern part of South America to the Portuguese, which includes Brazil and includes all those regions. And if you really look at a map and see that it bulges out past the coastline of North America and the Caribbean. So you have this region that's given to the Portuguese, and everything west of that line is given to the Spanish, and that also includes the Caribbean. So the Portuguese began immediately to focus on the areas around Brazil, and they began to develop plantations. And there's a fellow by the name of Verzon who traveled along the coast, and he described people. There's another fellow who was a very important explorer in 1500 who was one of the first reports of Native Americans that gave a physical description of Native Americans in Brazil. He described them as brownish red and with straight black hair and straight, thick black hair. And his descriptions of them, he said that they went naked, and he had other things that he talked about them in terms of a physical description. And they were very distinctively not African, of African heritage. They were distinctive morphologically and in appearance from Africans. And so as time went on, the Portuguese actually went in, and many of these people were unalived through war and the conquest of the land. Many were also unalived as a result of pandemic diseases that were spread by Europeans, because the people in South America did not have any natural immunities to some of the diseases carried by Europeans. And so you had very similar to plagues that occurred in Europe, where millions of people were wiped out as a result of a plague, a pandemic. You had a very similar situation happen, particularly in South America. And so Europeans then, the Portuguese specifically, began to focus on a transatlantic slave trade to find their sources of labor in kidnapping Africans from Angola, from the area that would be Cameroon, Southwest Africa, that whole region of the west coast of Africa, and taking them into slavery and bringing them to to Brazil, to plantations. And so there's a very distinctive history there, and there's a very clear record in terms of reports by so-called conquistadors. There's reports regarding the wars and conflicts and all those things that are going on. The Spanish, when we look at the record from the Spanish first began to conquer the Caribbean, and this is where Columbus first arrives. He arrives in what's called Hispaniola, and so the if we look at the Caribbean where the Spanish first come, we have reports from from a fellow by the name of Bartholomew de la Casa, who was a priest. In addition to Bartholomew de la Casa, there are about 10 other priests who write extensively about what happened. So we have a very robust record about what happened with the Spanish when the Spanish arrived and what they did over time. And there's a report, I think, that gives a good summary that's written in 1542 by Bartholomew de la Casa. And Bartholomew de la Casa points out that when they arrived, there were over 15 million Native Americans inhabiting approximately 60 islands in the Caribbean. And that included what would now be Cuba and Haiti and the Dominican Republic. It would include Jamaica. It would include Antigua, Martinique. It would include all of the islands, basically, of the Caribbean. He describes approximately 60 islands and claims that there are about 15 million people. And in 1492, this is, he comes shortly after 1492. He's back and forth. He's involved and directly. So he's a firsthand witness and observer. So are the other 10 or so people that are reporting this. And so they all report similarly. But, excuse me, Bartholomew de la Casa, what he does is he points out in 1542 that after less than 50 years, the population has been reduced from approximately 15 million people down to just a few hundred. So he is reporting that mass casualties of Native Americans, that the Native Americans are virtually wiped out. They're gone because they've been unalive through war. They've also been alive primarily through pandemic diseases, and he is reporting what's going on. And he actually makes a number of reports. He actually advocates against the enslavement of Native Americans because of the attrition rate, the rate at which they're being unalived. So he's, through this whole process, he's been an advocate against the enslavement of Native Americans. In addition to that, there's also a whole body of literature and evidence that is developed from records from the region. This is called the Columbian Exchange. Some call it the Caribbean Exchange. And what it focuses on is not only those 60 islands, but it also focuses on the coastal areas of northern part of South America, the Central American coastline, and in Mexico. And so this region, this part, they call it the Columbian Exchange. There's a report that comes out after 1600. It's an analysis of what happens between 1492 and 1600. And this is something that's well-researched, well-documented. And what they do is they focus on, for example, what types of crops were transplanted into the Caribbean that actually came from either Europe or came from Africa and were brought to the Caribbean. They also talk about animals that were brought from Africa, from Europe, and brought to the Caribbean that did not previously exist as part of the historical record in the Caribbean or in the Americas. For example, they brought hogs, pigs, they brought certain types of animals that did not previously exist in this landmass. And so it's important to be able to look at this Caribbean exchange. Dealt with animals, it dealt with botany, it dealt with plants. But one of the things that also focused on is that this region overall was reported to have as many as 54 million people. That included the Caribbean islands as well as the surrounding region. And that this population had been reduced by more than 95% during this period of time of what they call the Caribbean exchange between 1492 and 1600. So in essence, the Spanish had severely mismanaged the region. It was massive numbers of people that were unalived, and there was massive devastation. But it also was a period of time where massive wealth was gained by the Portuguese, both the Portuguese and the Spaniards, but the Spaniards in this region of the so-called Caribbean region. And but by the early 1600s, the Spaniards are being challenged for control of the land. Now, mind you, that by about 1510 or so, there begins to become a massive influx of Africans into the Caribbean. Because what is happening is, as the population of Native Americans declined, they began to try to replace the labor sources by bringing black people from Africa into the Caribbean. There also, after 1600, was an effort to move Native Americans from North America into the Caribbean. And this population also were significantly impaired and unalived. So you have records of massive numbers of Native Americans being captured, being shipped through the Carolinas, being shipped through other parts. And then there's also a lot of Native American women who are taken and they're sold north as domestic servants. But the mass number is that they were shipped into the Caribbean. And so what happens with those populations, we can see from later DNA evidence that those populations were absorbed into the African and the European populations, and they become a very, very small percentage of the DNA profile of Africans and a very small percentage of the DNA profile of Europeans. And so in terms of looking at the population, this population is diluted, it's reduced, it's gone in essence, and there's a very small percentage left as compared to what had previously been when Europeans first arrived, and even when Africans first started arriving as slaves. And so the Africans began to replace the Native Americans in the Caribbean. By the time the British began to come in, more than 100 years had already passed. There was already a major admixture for those surviving Native Americans came in that survived. Africans had already begun to place those who were lost and began to admix. So when you look at DNA, for example, today of the typical Jamaican DNA profile is about 70% African and less than like 1% Native American. If you look at places like Haiti, only in rare instances do you get any Native American DNA. When you look at other places like, for example, Cuba and Puerto Rico, you get a higher percentage of Native American, in some cases up to close to 10%. But for the most part, it's a very, very small admixture, and across the region, it's less than 2%. So in terms of looking at what happened, we see this the historical events, how they unfolded. And what we see is that now the British come in. And when the British come in, the population of Native Americans is already decimated. And the population of Africans has already risen. And this is why, for example, the British gained control of Jamaica in 1655 and immediately inherited what's called the Maroon Wars. And the Maroon Wars were Africans, many Ashanti, many Akan, many groups of Africans who are banded together, who are organized, who recognize African heritage and culture. And they have separated themselves and are literally fighting a war against the British that lasted for nearly 100 years, called the Maroon Wars. And so it's important to understand that those wars actually spilled over as far as to New York, where they had what they called the New York Rebellion of something like 1712, 1714. They had another New York Rebellion in around 1740. You had you had the Stono Rebellion. If you look at what happened and look at the historical record and historical evidence, what you'll find is that the British colonies primarily consisted of Africans who had been transplanted by the Spanish already. And then they continued to import Africans. And it's also important to recognize that the British kept detailed records of their shipments. And they clearly in their records distinguished the Africans. And because they sold and even had different pricing structures so that Africans were considered to be much more expensive and valuable than Native Americans, because the Native Americans didn't last. They had a high attrition rate. Native Americans or Africans were priced much higher, and there's evidence of the records and sales and all of that indicate and show the predominance of and the prevalence of Africans being sold. So when we look at the evidence and the documentation, this ideal that there's some kind of paper genocide, that they're somehow replaced, that they're mislabeled. There are instances where in some areas the populations are mixed in. They're called colored usually. And what happens is there's no distinction in some cases between the African and the Native American on some records. But in most cases, when you look at those, it's the local record, and that there's the records that are the official governmental records, or just part of the governments that are part of the empire, clearly distinguishes between Africans and the so-called Indians. And so in terms of to say that they're somehow counseled, or that they were not smart enough to understand their own identity, and somehow their identity got lost because somebody labeled them on a piece of paper that they never even saw. It's a ridiculous notion. It's a ridiculous ideal. But it's also important to look at this British period that starts somewhere around 1620 and goes to about 1865, that you have an influx of Africans coming from the African continent being shipped directly. About 388,000 are documented. And then in addition to that, you have another 70,000 Africans who are brought to the Caribbean. And it's clear they are Africans that are then shipped to North America, because the records indicate that. And so in terms of, we see this population, and we also have to consider the attrition. We have to consider some of the other factors involved. You also look at the fact that you have the 13 colonies receiving this 400 and some thousand Africans. But at this time, Louisiana, its purchase has not occurred. Florida is not included in their data, and the regions obtained through the Mexican-American Wars, none of that's obtained yet. And so in terms of when we look at the numbers and the population, all these other things have an impact because you have people that were enslaved that were brought into these other regions that you later have to factor in. So in terms of looking at and understanding the populations, in understanding the DNA evidence, the historical evidence is clearly supported by the DNA evidence, and the DNA evidence confirms the historical record. So the ideal that there's somehow some independent group of Black Aboriginal Native Americans who are non-African, who are non-Amerindian, there's just simply no evidence to support this hypothesis. In addition to that, it's also, I think, critical to take a look at another factor I think that's very important, that there is a robust amount of DNA evidence harvested from most of the mounds around the United States were actually excavated at some point. Many have been made into parks. They've been maintained. And the reason why they're historical sites that you can go see now is simply because they were maintained in part of some state or governmental project to preserve them. But in this process, nearly all of them have had DNA extracted from what burials took place there. And these burials, there's a robust record of DNA databases of this evidence. And the overwhelming consensus in the scientific community is that the people buried in these mounds, whether they're the Mississippian cultures or other cultures throughout the Americas, that they in fact are of Amerindian descent. They come from the group that came here, migrated from the Bering Strait, and that's their DNA profile. And they have no connection at all to the so-called Black Aboriginal Native Americans. So the mounds give us no support for the ideal that there's somehow a Black Aboriginal Native American population. It just simply does not exist. The evidence does not support that. So in addition to this, I think it's also something else that's significant in terms of looking at the evidence from the DNA evidence from the mounds. One of the other things I think that becomes extremely important for us to take a look at is that when we look at the evidence of the existence of people in the Americas, you find the oldest real fossil remains of modern man, of Homo sapiens sapien. You find him in the Americas going back about 13,000 years ago. There are no remains prior to that period. There's a footprint supposedly in what is the White Sands National Park or whatever, and they say, well, there's a footprint that goes back 23,000 years and it proves that people were here, but there's no other evidence other than a footprint. So it is possible that someone strayed and traveled here early in an isolated incident and left a footprint. It's very possible, but there's no evidence of any settlements. There's no community. There's no burial grounds. There's no other skeletal remains. So when we look at this evidence, it's really insignificant in terms of the overall historical record. It doesn't show that there was any settlement of people by that time. So the real oldest evidence we have is about 13,000 years ago. In addition, there is a mastodon bone that they found that goes back 123,000 years, and it's claimed that, well, see, people were here from 123,000 years ago, that people were already here, but there's only a mastodon bone and no other evidence of people settling. And this mastodon bone is considered evidence of people only because of its similarity to mastodon bones found other places in the world that indicated that people used tools to scrape the bones. And so these bones have scrapings. But these bones could just as easily have been scraped by other animals. there are other logical explanations for these bones. In addition to that, it could also be isolated individuals or small band of individuals that did not survive, that did not take root, did not settle, that came that period of time ago. So that doesn't actually, it just it doesn't really mean anything within the context of seeing that the very first genuine settlers came about 13,000 years ago. And this is consistent with when we examine the evidence that supports the science around the out of Africa science. We don't have people, we have man being born in Africa over 300,000 years ago. And then he doesn't begin to spread out until between 70,000, 100,000 and 70,000 years ago. Then he migrates into the Arabian Peninsula. He reaches Europe by 40,000 years ago. He reaches the southern part of Asia like 65,000 years ago. He reaches India. He reaches Siberia about 25,000 years ago. And if we look at the evidence of man being in the Americas is consistent with the overall model, the overall picture of the evidence of showing the migrations of man out of Africa, spreading out, radiating out around the globe. In addition, it's also, I think, very critical for us to look at many times people that are arguing and saying that there's some Aboriginal Black Native Americans, they will refer to the out of America theory. But when you actually talk to them, you realize they don't understand the out of America theory. And they don't know what it is. That the out of America theory was something that was developed by an Argentinian anthropologist. And it was a proposed theory that man originated in the Americas, that he originated from small primates. But there was no fossil record to support this theory. It was not supported by DNA evidence. It was not supported by anything other than it being a theory that someone wrote about, and it became something that was just shelved because it was never actually supported by any evidence. And the person who wrote it actually ultimately rejected it. But what happens is it was revived, it was put out there among conspiracy theorists, and then it was promoted as something to say that, well, this could be where the Black Aboriginal Native Americans came from, that we were always here because man started in the Americas. But there's no actual evidence to support that. And so it's important for us to be able to put it in context and recognize the fact that you don't find Neanderthals in America. You don't find Denisovians in America. You don't find any other groups of humans, of people, of humanoids, or hominids. You don't find the people. You don't find them in their primitive state. You don't find them in America. So you don't find fossil records like you find in Africa, where fossil records go back like 3.5 million years. There's also another popular modern myth that's going on, and you see it on TikTok where they'll come and they'll say that there's a man by the name of Albert Perry, and his DNA shows that that man was in the Americas. He was from South Carolina, and it proves that he was, that there were black people here long ago before anybody else in Africa, because his Y DNA. But if you actually look at the official report of his DNA, what you'll find is that people essentially just lied about it and misrepresented it, because Albert Perry actually didn't have a DNA test. It was one of his grandchildren had a DNA test, and they studied his DNA going through his paternal lineage. Albert Perry actually went back to Cameroon in Africa, and it showed Y DNA going back almost 100,000 years prior to any known Y DNA study prior to that. Usually it was the mDNA that goes back to Lucy Mbujige, the mother of humanity, that goes back in Africa. It was part of the mitochondrial Eve study that was done by Dr. Rebecca Kahn who studied DNA mitochondria. So in terms of looking at this, the Albert Perry story actually opposes the ideal that there were black Aboriginal Native Americans already here. And it supports it's just additional evidence in out of Africa, and it just supports the fact that they can now trace the Y chromosome back further than they previously could. So in terms of the misinformation that's promoted out there, that's put out there as a result of people that are trying to mislead, that we have to really look at the evidence and be able to understand what's happening so that we can recognize and be grounded in truth and reality. So one of the other things I wanted to point out is that if we look at whether it's the Mississippian cultures or what they call the Adena culture or the Hopewell cultures, we can look at all of these, and there is no evidence in the fossil record, in DNA studies, to establish that there is an Aboriginal, there's a black Aboriginal Native American. And it's important for us to make the distinction that these individuals have universally come up as Amerindians, in which the so-called pretendians claim are so-called $5 Indians. They say that there's some admixture and they're not the real Indians. But there's about 9 million people that claim to be American Indians, Native Americans, that are all considered Amerindian, that have the same genetic historical roots in the Americas. And they are a separate and distinctive group from the people who are often now called pretendians, who claim that they are Native Americans, when in fact there's no evidence to support that. And let me say that I have always been open that if someone could show me evidence and share evidence with me, then I would go with it. I'd accept it. But so far, I've found no one that has been able to provide me any credible evidence at all. And so when I first started having these discussions, one of the things that happened to me was that someone came and they gave me this presentation, this elaborate presentation, and they started out with a map saying that, well, Europeans, they recognized that there was a Mer culture in the Caribbean, and there was a Mer civilization, and these were black people, and they presented all of this, and then they tried to connect this Mer culture civilization to the Moors. But as they talked about it, they presented a document called the India Nova Map from the 1500s. And this India Nova Map was supposed to be one of the earliest maps that Europeans drew of the Americas. But if you go back, and what I discovered was that if you go back and actually go to the original India Nova maps, not one of them shows the word Mer or the Mer culture designated on the map as they presented to me. So they presented me a fraudulent map, a fake map that had been doctored and altered in order to make their argument that there was a Mer culture in the Caribbean. And so, in terms of the evidence, when we look at the evidence, all of this was debunked. And then, they go further to say that, well, the Mer people were all over the planet. These were dark, melanated black people, and they were Moors or whatever. But the reality of it is that they were not. You can come and try to label them that now, but the reality is they were all distinctive groups of people that came up separately, that grew up in different regions. So you had people that came up that went to Australia. You had people that went to Asia. You had those that came to Americas, and they became distinctive groups of people that were separate. And in terms of that, there's a succession of population where population migrations occur and a group becomes isolated. They eventually develop their own distinctive language because they're isolated from others for so much time. And over a period of time, because they're not recording what happened, there's no evidence. They don't have any recollection of each other. And so in terms of the history, there's no documented history. But today we can examine the DNA and see the succession of haplogroups. And so by looking at the evidence that exists in the DNA, we can document and have established that there are no Black Aboriginal Native Americans here in the Americas that predated Columbus, and that somehow there's this group of Black people now who claim they, in fact, are that group of people. They don't exist, only as a fantasy, only as a mental construct. Also, I think it's important to recognize that there's another element of this, I think, and that is that you have about 9 million people who hold legitimate claims to Native American American Indian heritage. Those people are documented in the census. They're documented in various other methods throughout the country, and so what's happening is we have people that are attempting to usurp their identity and to trample on their identity, their heritage, and usurp and claim their identity falsely. And this is destructive. This is a problem. It's divisive. And the question is this just coming from those Black people doing this themselves, or is it being promoted to Black people from an outside source? I submit that it's being promoted to them by outside sources, and that the information and misinformation is coming to them through troll farms, and they're being misled and fed a constant diet of misinformation through troll farms. And so I think it's really important for us to be able to look at it and to understand it. I also want to mention, which is very often presented and discussed as part of this this claim that somehow there was a mislabeling or whatever, is a fellow by the name of Walter Plecker from Virginia, and the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. So let's recognize, first of all, the fact that the United States Census began in 1860 to distinguish Native Americans as a separate, distinctive group of people identified in the United States Census. So they are identified separately from Black people, and so and people of African descent, African heritage. And so in terms of looking at and understanding this particular group of people, they are identified in the census. And so in general, even if there are minor errors or whatever, overall, in general, this is consistent to the time when people began being able to self-report. And so it's all consistent with people ultimately being able to self-report. But the fact of the matter is that the ideal that Walter Plecker somehow changed everybody's identity is just simply false. Because Walter Plecker, first of all, he had no control over any federal census. He was a vital statistics administrator for the state of Virginia, not federal. And if you look at the federal census, you'll see that the population, there's at the very most, you could potentially argue that about 626 people were impacted by Walter Plecker in his attempting to classify Native Americans as, quote, Negroes. But if you look at that, the Native Americans had previously self-identified and been identified in several prior, their family had been identified as Negro. And they, in fact, were considered Negro, and they had small admixtures of Native American because of whether it was intermarriage, whether they had been enslaved and freed. There were a number of different ways, but they were, in fact, Africans who had been admixed. And what happened is there was a distinctive group of Native Americans there who actually wanted to be YT, because being YT would give them benefits of having access to free public education. It would give them access to other resources that would be available to them by way of being YT. They were part of the Racial Integrity Act, which had a clause in it or that was called the Pocahontas exception. So if you had a percentage, in other words, if you had enough percentage of YT blood and a small enough percentage of Native American blood, then you could be considered YT. And this was what was really an issue with Walter Plecker. But people take it and distort the facts surrounding it and make it appear as though he was somehow trying to hide the identity of Native Americans and fool black people into thinking that, fool Native Americans into thinking that they were black people. It just simply is not the case. It just simply is not supported by any evidence. And it also is something that is not supported in any of the other states. So when we begin to look at the actual evidence in other states, we don't find this taking place. And certainly there are racial integrity statutes, there's eugenics, there's all of those things are going on. But they do not reclassify someone and say, you are black and you're a Native American. The statistics and the data are consistent, and it's a very clear and distinctive record if we examine it closely. And so it's very important for us to recognize that this is just part of more misinformation that is being given to us to mislead us. I think it's also very significant to look at, for example, you have people that say, oh, well, my ancestors, we have records that go back to the 1400s before Columbus came. And I even was having a discussion with someone and they were telling me how, well, our family records go back prior to Columbus coming and we were always here and all that kind of stuff, right? And I said, well, what kind of records do you have? And then the person started talking about, well, we have the family Bible, was passed down in the family Bible. And so I asked him, I said, okay, well, where did they get the Bible from? And they fell silent because they didn't realize that what they were saying made absolutely no sense, because there were no Bibles here. There's no evidence of a Bible being here prior to Columbus. So if they have family records that were passed down through a Bible, then it wasn't before Columbus, And so then you'll also find there's a number of writings where there's a general talk about Native Americans and the speculation about the history. And sometimes it's just a part of oral history that was passed down. And they will take that and tie themselves to it with no actual evidence to tie themselves to it, to claim that they, in fact, are Native American, when in fact there's no real evidence to support it. So you actually do have a large number of black people who will claim to be Native American because of the level of profound self-hate, that they don't want to be African because they view Africa as something negative. They see it as something bad. They don't want to be connected to it, and they disdain being African. They also don't want to be the Native. They don't know that they're not real Native Americans, so they in essence bash the real Native Americans, and in essence usurp their identity, because the evidence shows they're not really them, and it's obvious they're not them. So they create a new distinct identity that's purely based in fantasy and misinformation. And I also want to mention the Homestead Acts, because you got to remember that the original Homestead Act of 1862, where you get 60 acres and you homestead that land and you get 60 acres, it specifically excluded Indians and Native Americans. As a matter of fact, many of the homesteads that were given in the Homestead Act were land taken from Native Americans who were pushed off the land under Indian removal. And so So this is inconsistent. You have people saying, "Oh, well, our family, we got land in a homestead, and we were, but it's inconsistent with the facts. In addition to that, if we look at, for example, there were some Native Americans who, after 1875, had access to certain unclaimed lands, and then under the Dow's Act of 1887, people were given, Native Americans were given up to 160-acre lots, but designated in specific Native American reserved lands, right? And so it's important to be able to make those distinctions and to understand where those lands were, where those people were. And we realize that some of the places where these folks are from that are making these claims, they're not where that land was given. What they've done is they've heard misinformation, and they're just regurgitating misinformation. So today, there's about 46.9 million people who are identified as Black or African American in the United States. And of this group of people who are considered Black or African American, about 41.5 or 41.9 million of those are from, in fact, from 41.5 million are in fact from sub-Saharan Black Africa. Their ancestors trace back, about 95% of their ancestors trace back from between modern Senegal and Angola, and a little less than 5% trace their ancestry back to Southeast Africa and Madagascar. And a typical person of African descent has heritage from 3 to 5 regions in Africa, which illustrates the admixture over multiple generations where there was intermarry between people that were descendants of different groups in Africa, so that you may have, a percentage of your DNA that's from Ghana, a percentage that's from Nigeria, a percentage that's from Cameroon, a percentage that's from Angola, a percentage that's from Gambia. So in terms of looking at and understanding the evidence, I think it's extremely important to recognize also that at 46.9 million Black people, there is about 2.6 million of those come from the Caribbean, from Central and South America, and from regions outside of the boundaries of the United States. And these people have come to America. They are part of the Black or African American community. And if you look at their distinctive profile, their DNA profile, as I mentioned, those people that are from Haiti have from 96 to 98% of their DNA is sub-Saharan Black African. From Jamaica, 70% Black African. When you look at all of the different islands, their distinctive profiles. There are distinctive profiles for Black people from Central and South America. And then we can, in addition to that, see, for example, there's a population of about 12 million Afro-Colombians, people that were enslaved in Colombia, brought from Africa, made into slaves in Colombia. They went through a period of time where eventually there was an ending, abolition of slavery. They went through various different kinds of discrimination and have had a very similar experience that Black people in America, in the United States, have had. Same thing, there's about 112 million Black people in Brazil. There's about 12 million, about 2.5 million in Mexico. When we start looking at the populations in Central and South America, the Caribbean, we can even look in places like Iran, where there are about 13.8 million Afro-Iranians who came as slaves from, their ancestors came as slaves from East Africa. And we can see something similar to that all across the world, where Black people were taken into slavery and dispersed all around the world. So it's very important for us to be able to put the data together and to recognize. One of the other things I think it's important for us to do is go back and take a look at the reports of Europeans, because there are a lot of people now who claim that there are European reports that describe the people as black people, and they use that as a justification to say that they are somehow black Aboriginal Native Americans. But in actually every case, there's about 39 specific incidents of this. There's a report in every case that has been examined so far. Once you fully examine it, you realize that the people reporting, saying this is evidence, is actually misrepresenting what the actual documents say. So, for example, you have Verrazana, 1524. He describes people that he's seeing as dark in color, and he says not unlike Ethiopians with thick black hair. So he's describing them distinctively, saying, you know, they're like Ethiopians with they got thick black hair. He talks about them. He says that the women have an arrangement of hair such as women in Egypt and Syria. And of course, his reference point at that point would be Arabs in 1554 when he writes, because his exposure of the world at that time would have exposed him to Arabs being in those particular locations. The Ethiopian, in the reference to a dark skin, is not evidence to say that these were somehow black people that were here that are morphologically and genetically connected to the black people today who are claiming that they are somehow Native Americans. The fact of the matter is that these groups of people are connected to the Amerindian people who came by way of the Bering Strait. And so in terms of looking at the evidence, and there are multiple other instances where they're described, and they're described almost always as having straight black hair. They are described morphologically very different from Africans. Very often they may be described as having a hooked nose, certain other characteristics that indicate a morphology very different than what exists. And then the DNA evidence indicates that these groups of people were in fact Amerindians, and they are not. They're connected to the people who today claim themselves to be Native American. And many of the people today, if you actually survey the Native American community today, those people who claim to be Native American, who have evidence of being Native American, what you'll find is that they, in fact, have a wide range of melanation. So you have some very dark-skinned Native Americans today with straight black hair, that genetically, when they studied their DNA, it shows that they are connected to the Amerindians. And they meet all of the characteristics that are in the descriptions that are by the various people that reported, European explorers that reported the 39 instances of their reports. And so I think it's significant to be able to look at and to understand it and put it all in context. So there's a couple other things I want to just point out. For example, if we look at the idea that there was somehow this group of people called the Yamasee that say that they were black people. If you look at some of the descriptions that you get, people making and saying, oh, these were Yamasee people and all that kind of stuff. The fact of the matter is there was about 200 years that passed between the time that this conflict between the Yamasee and South Carolina occurred between around 1615 to 1617. 1715 to 1717. During this time of this so-called Yamasee conflict, if you go back, what you'll find is the Yamasee people were an admixture of multiple different groups of people from different tribes. And this was a generic label. The Yamasee was a generic label given to a particular group of people located along South Carolina and that region. And in fact, they did have some people that had nappy hair. But if you look at and examine the record, they were here and intermixed with Africans for almost 200 years before these reports took place. So And what you have is you have Native Americans who are of African admixture. And that's where you get the distinctive group of people. And then after the war, when the people spread out and break up, they break out. Some of them become part of the Seminoles. Some of them become part of various other groups. And so the groupings that we hear and people talk about are not necessarily the groupings of how they self-identified. They're how we categorize them after the fact. And so the fact of the matter is there's no evidence that there's a Yamasee group of people that support the existence of an Black Aboriginal Native American, because any and all DNA evidence associated therewith points to the actual Native Americans and not to this group of people who claim that they are somehow Black Aboriginal Native Americans. In addition to that, we can look at and just do the math on the population data. We can look at the migration data from records, particularly during the British times, and none of it supports the claims that are being made. In addition to that, there's several other things I think that is important to take a look at, because there are numerous other reports in the North America, and particularly in the 1700s, where there are Europeans who document how they viewed Native Americans. Many were dark, they had straight hair, etc. They're very similar to earlier reports and don't support a separate existence of a group of Black people who are non-Amerindian, who are non-African, who somehow exist independently, and that it just is not there. There's no evidence to support it. And so I think it's very important to recognize, like, for example, even there was a case called Hudgens versus Wright. There was a 1906 case, and it was a woman who claimed she was a Native American, and she claimed that in Virginia that she could not be enslaved because in 1705, Native American slavery was banned in Virginia in 1705. So she could not be a slave because she was a Native American, and Native Americans couldn't be slaves under 1705 law. And what they did was she was able to establish that her grandmother had been a Native American. Because she could show her maternal line, she actually won in court in terms of being enslaved. But significantly, she had African grandfather, and had a number of Africans in her lineage. And so she was actually only in part Native American, and she was able to procure her freedom because she was able to prove that she was part Native American, and that this part of her allowed her to have the exemption of law because slavery against Native Americans was banned in 1705. So when we began to really look at some of those laws, we see that the application of many of those laws, that if there were Native Americans, if there were people that were actually Native Americans that were non-mixed, that they, in fact, the argument is not supported in terms of when you take a look at it, because slavery was actually banned and outlawed in some of those areas, around 1700 and shortly thereafter. And so between 1730 and 1740, there was no more Native American slavery. And so when you really look at it, any people that were Native Americans that were enslaved, by the time you get to 1790, they are admixed, and 9 times out of 10 they will be admixed already because of the period of time that had passed and the level of interaction. But by 1790, when you get a population of people that are enslaved in the Americas as a new country, at the very best, you have some people that may have that are black people that have some Native American heritage, usually many generations back. In most cases, by then either undetectable or at that time they may have had some memory of it, but by today it's undetectable in terms of in their genetic. It would be like if you go back 10 generations, you look at the number of people in your DNA going back 10, 15, 20 generations, it could go get into millions of people. And if you got one Native American in that DNA, that doesn't make you Native American. You have like 1 out of a million DNA contributors, and then you claim you're a Native American because you have 1 out of a million DNA contributors. The bottom line, it's an issue that has a mental component to it. It's very similar to the what is illustrated in the book, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. It's a fantasy world that's created. So in terms of being able to look at this and to really begin to understand the situation, it's just so critical for us to begin to really fully examine some of the evidence and to look at what happened. Because today there's a bunch of misinformation that's going around. There's an effort to mislead us, to misguide us, and to separate us and to cause division within the black community, and to try to cause us to become divided against each other, to not identify with each other. Because the fact of the matter is that black people, we experienced an African Holocaust. And if we look at in Africa, about 32.5 million black people were taken into slavery, including about 12.5 million were taken into slavery through the transatlantic slave trade and brought to North, Central, South America, and the Caribbean. And those populations include black people in the United States, the Afro-Caribbeans, the Afro-Colombians, the Afro-Venezuelans, the Afro-Cubans, the Afro, various groups like from Nicaragua, and Mexico, and Honduras, and Costa Rica, and Peru, and Chile, and Venezuela. You have all of these African communities, people of African descent that exist, and there's a fear that we'll connect with each other, that we will become aware of our connection to each other, and we will become aware that we have a historical bond because we all were taken into slavery. And many of the people that are in those places, they are cousins because they were part of our family that was taken. Some of us were taken and sent to the North America, some to Central America, some to South America, some to the Caribbean. And there were 179 slave ports that we were brought through in the Americas alone that are well-documented slave ports. And so when we look at the population, they don't want you to realize how you connect to black Afro-Brazilians, to Afro-Colombians or Afro-Venezuelans or Peruvians or Afro-Chileans or Afro-Nicaraguans or Hondurans or Costa Ricans or Mexicans. They don't want you to see how you connect. And then they may speak French, or they may speak Spanish or Portuguese or Dutch, but they also were people who were your family, and they just happened to be taken into slavery by someone who spoke Dutch or French or Portuguese. And so that's the reality of the situation, that you are connected to this group of people that are part of this hemisphere, that are part of what's called the black diaspora. And you're also connected because some people were taken and brought to the Americas, but there were about 11 million black people, from sub-Saharan black Africa, taken into slavery through the trans-Sahara slave trade. And they were taken to places like, they were taken across the Sahara Desert and then taken in ships from across North Africa, taken into the so-called Middle East. They were taken into the Baltics. They were taken to places like Turkey and Syria, all those places. And this is why you have large slave populations in those regions and descendants of those populations that exist today, that are Afro-Syrian, that are Afro-Turkish, that are Afro-Iraqi, Afro-Iranians. And so, like I mentioned earlier, you got about 13.8 million Afro-Iranians in the southern part of Iran that are still getting discriminated against today, just like black people are in other parts of the world. So it's important to recognize also that the largest slave rebellion documented in human history was the Zanj Rebellion in 869 that took place in Iraq, in Basra, Iraq, where there were large plantations, there were mines, there was about 500,000 black East Africans. And it was called the Zanj Rebellion. And the people of East Africa was called the Zanj, the land of the Zanj. And the Zanj people, black people from East Africa, were taken into slavery. And you had as many as 500,000 that staged a long-term rebellion in Basra, Iraq, a historic event in 869 AD. And so in terms of looking at and understanding also, you had the East Africa Indian Ocean slave trade. And this East Africa Indian Ocean slave trade, there's a bunch of historical sites along the coast of East Africa that include Zanzibar and many others, where there were major ports where people were taken out of Africa and enslaved and taken to India and to Iran and Iraq and taken to Afghanistan and Pakistan and the Philippines, to Indonesia, and scattered throughout those regions by Arabs, because those areas were under Muslim Islamic control as part of the Islamic Caliphate. And so if we understand it, slavery actually was conducted almost 800 years by Arabs and Berbers against sub-Saharan black Africans, almost 800 years before Europeans even came and got involved in it. And so it's important to be able to really understand the significance and understand the connection and to be able to realize the history and how we are connected, how we connect to black people all over the world that were part of the African diaspora, that were transported all over the world for purposes of slavery. It's also important to recognize that the Berlin Conference in 1884, Europeans sat down and divided up Africa into colonial territories. The United States was at the table. The Ottoman Empire was at the table when this division took place, because they all had business interests in Africa. And if you look at what happened, that prior to that, there was a subjugation of Africa and the mass unaliving of black people all over Africa, and the subjugation of lands and taking over of territories, and then the colonialization. And when you look at, for example, immediately following the Berlin Conference, for a period of about 25 years after that, the King Leopold of Belgium in the so-called Congo Free State went in and unalived between 10 and 15 million black people were unalived at a time when rubber plantations became significant, and that it was a big market for rubber. And because there was an abundance of rubber that was natural to the Congo, they actually literally tortured people and forced them to labor and unalived as many as 15 million black people. One of the most significant atrocities in human history took place during that particular time in Africa. In addition to that, there's in Southwest Africa, the Germans went in and they tried to exterminate the population there. And there's something called the Shark Island massacres, where the Germans started the first concentration camps long before they did in Germany. They developed these concentration camps in Southwest Africa and what is now Namibia. And in the Shark Island massacres, they put people in concentration camps and then they unalived them. So when we look at this history, we also see that some 50 million people are claimed to have been unalived in Southeast Africa when Cecil Rhodes actually developed De Beers diamonds, and they took control of the areas of Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and those regions, northern Rhodesia and southern Rhodesia, and they established the diamond industry, the worldwide diamond industry, and they began to take other minerals and wealth out of South Africa. They literally exterminated a significant portion of the population. When Jan van Riebeeck came to South Africa, the Dutch, they found diamonds on the beach. And they ended up almost completely exterminating the Kansu people and the Khoikhoi, and a number of different groups of Africans were almost completely extinct as a result of their greed and their actions to try to subdue the population in order to gain control of the land and get extract the wealth from the community. And so all of this is part of the African heritage. It's a worldwide African heritage because we were all part of a coordinated effort to put black people into slavery, to take Africa, subdue Africa's lands, and to gain massive wealth. And it became the foundation of Western civilization. It became the foundation of the wealth of Europe. It became the foundation of the wealth of America. And so this is the source of this wealth. It's the source of the development of this civilization. And so we look at the black people that were taken, and you have people like, for example, the Windward Coast and the so-called Rice Coast in West Africa, where they took people, literally transplanted whole groups of people from West Africa and took them to South Carolina and Georgia to do rice plantations and to grow rice. They developed a system to seize the wealth of Africa. And so understanding this history and then realizing where we are today. Today, we are in a situation where sub-Saharan Africa, there's about 1.3 billion black sub-Saharan black Africans that are one of the largest emerging markets that exist in the world today. If you look at what's happening, you see 4 of the 5 largest coltan mines, that you couldn't have a cell phone without coltan, is from which titanium comes from, which is an essential part of a cell phone and computers. So this whole industry is fueled by this mineral wealth that comes out of the Congo. We can look at the United States. The second largest supplier of oil to the United States is West Africa, not Saudi Arabia, not the Gulf states, but West Africa. We can look at, and then the first supplier is Canada to the United States. So in terms of looking at, we have major industries that rely on resources that come out of Africa, whether it's cocoa for chocolate, whether it is various other types of vegetables and commodities, whether it's oil, whether it is tungsten, uranium, whether it's zinc, bauxite, chromium, manganese, titanium, you have, or even uranium. It's coming out of Africa, and it fuels the industrial systems of the world. So people are still scrambling, fighting over and trying to get position, jockeying for position in Africa. And black people in America are naturally connected to Africa historically. We never gave up Africa. Africa was taken from us. We were snatched and kidnapped from Africa and brought to the Americas. And African countries are welcoming us. They're opening the door saying, hey, come home. This is, you can get citizenship. Come on, And so there are many people in this country who have dual citizenships, who have multiple citizenships, who are Americans, but they also have citizenships in other countries. They have financial interests that are global. And so if we look at and understand who we are and understand our international stature as a group of people, we will recognize how we tie to the rest of the world, how we connect to the global community. And so it's critical for us to wake up and gain an understanding of our history, because our history is best qualified to inform us of our current identity, to inform us of our role in the world today. And what's happening is we have so many people now who are lost, who don't understand their history, who don't understand how they connect. They're searching for false identities. It's like trying to put on a coat. They're cold in the winter, and they're trying to find a coat that they can put on. So they just find any old coat that looks like it might fit. So they say that they are Asiatic black, or they'll say they are a Moor, or they'll say they are a black Hebrew, or they'll say that they are a black Aboriginal Native American. And they embrace these false identities. When Black America, about 95% of Black America's African ancestors come from between 3 and 5 regions in sub-Saharan Black Africa, between modern Senegal and Angola. 3 to 5 regions. And less than 5% come from Southeast Africa and Madagascar. So this is what the DNA evidence shows. This is what the historical evidence and records show from the slave trade. This is what the documentation shows in terms of the self-reports of Black people. So when we look at and examine sacred Black history, the self-report of Black people, where Black people themselves documented what happened to them, and who wrote it down, who learned to read and write and wrote it down. There's just a robust body of literature that supports all of this. And so the fact of the matter is that in order for us to move forward, we have to educate ourselves. We have to understand who we are. We have to transmit this from one generation to the next. And the fact of the matter is that if we look at and understand and recognize our history and recognize how we connect to the rest of the world, we will find that our future lies in us being able to organize, to come together, to build business together, to build commerce together, to address the needs of our communities together. Because today, Black people in America are under attack. The gains that we made during the Civil Rights era are under attack. There's an effort to erode all of the gains that we made, to take them back, to set us back to pre-Civil Rights era conditions. So they're moving to take away our voting rights. They're taking away our civil rights. They are eliminating Black history from public education. They are eliminating programs that give Black people opportunities to become gainfully employed. They're eliminating anti-discrimination clauses in contracts. They're taking positions that set us back and subject us to the humiliation of racism, and that subject us to white supremacy. And there's an active doctrine of white supremacy that is underfoot, that is in operation, and that is now the ideological framework that is driving the governmental forces in this country today. And we have to be able to recognize what it is, and to be able to understand what it is, and to be able to stand up and be who we are. Because all we got to do is understand and be who we are, and it will change everything. It will change everything. And so this is why I'm so persistent in bringing this message, to talk about our history, to debunk the myths, to bring the word, if you will, in order to dispel the darkness, to dispel the misinformation, to dispel the lies and half-truths that clutter many of our minds and that hold us back. And so with that, I'm gonna bring it to an end and say thank you for listening. Thank you for taking the time to listen. And I pray that this information that we've shared has been helpful, that it will help somebody, that, excuse me, that you will share this information with others, and that we can grow this conversation. And because one of our goals is an African Holocaust Memorial World Assembly by 2030, so that Black people everywhere around the world, Black people of African heritage, can be able to come together and recognize what happened to us and acknowledge the existence of our African Holocaust, so that it will never, ever, ever happen again, and that we can move forward in prosperity and peace, and we can build a future that will bless the entire world. So with that, thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.